Hello and welcome back to Storytime with Alex. We're now on story number 2 in From Allbyon to Britannia, book 1, The Witches of Old Albion, written by Brandy Pearson, my mum. And the second story is called The Witch and the White Mouse. Once upon a time in Old Albion, where witches cared for people and wizards cared for books, at least according to the witches, and witches cared for gossip and wizards cared for fact, according to the wizards, there was a wandering witch whose name was Ruth Northover. She had spent the winter in the town of Woodley End telling stories, using her magic for healing and generally helping out where she could. But when spring came, she set out to walk the highway through the great forest and visit the villages along the way. This was her custom every year, and she enjoyed this journey, especially on fine spring days. Today was grey, but not wet. The ancient road was well cared for by the villages it passed through, and the beech and elm trees on either side of the road rose up like the pillars of a cathedral. There was an almost reverential quiet, and the spring growth gave a pale green blush to the grey branches. She could smell spring all around. Apart from a break in the middle of the day to eat her lunch of bread and cheese and apples, and to drink from a nearby stream, she had been walking all day. Twilight was coming early amid the tall trees as she drew near the village of Stoke, so she could not at first identify the small white creature on the road. As she came closer, she realised that it was a white mouse, sitting in the middle of the path. It looked up at her as she drew closer, but made no attempt to run away. Ruth bent down to speak to it. "Run along, little mouse," she said, shooing it away. "If you stay in the middle of the highway, an owl or a cat will spy you and eat you for his supper." The mouse continued to look up at her as if it might have understood her, but did not move out of the road. "You seem confused, Mouse. Maybe you've had an accident. Come here and let me look at you." She held out her hand, and the mouse scampered onto it without a second's hesitation. She felt the little scratchy claws. She could see no wounds, but there was also a tiny tingle of something else, something magical. However, it was beginning to get dark, and she needed to get on to Stoke. So she popped the mouse in one of her pockets, where she knew there were biscuit crumbs, and continued on to the village. The people of Stoke were always very welcoming to Ruth Northover, and she enjoyed staying there. There was a well-kept village green, with St Leonard's Church and its tidy graveyard on one side, and a smithy on the other. It was not a big enough village to have an inn. Father Simon was the parish priest, and Adam was the smith. Ruth stayed with the smith and his wife Joanna. Nearby lived Mother Ann, the midwife, but there were no other healers. It was a time before many witches took to a settled life, and there had been no wizard in that part of the forest for a generation. If anything serious occurred, Father Simon would travel to Woodley End and seek help from the apothecary, as there was no wizard there either. This year they seemed especially pleased to see her. "Mistress Ruth, we've been looking out for you," said Adam the smith, coming out of the smithy to greet her. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Rats, black rats," said Joanna. "They arrived on New Year's Day. First one, then another and another. By the end of the day there were hundreds running about. We set the cats and the dogs on them. We chased them with brooms and cleavers. We thought we had got rid of them, but then the next day it all happened again." "But they weren't ordinary rats," said Father Simon, who had come along when he heard she had arrived. "When a dog catches one, or someone hits one with something, they disappear and just leave a black smudge. Half the village is spending their days hunting rats." "Are there any round at the moment?" Ruth asked. "That's another strange thing about them. They only appear in sunlight. It's been cloudy most of today, so there are only a few. We dispatched them this morning." Mistress Ruth spent the evening visiting small babies and old folk with Mother Ann, giving out herbal remedies and singing healing spells. Adam and Joanna gave her a fine, substantial supper. She occasionally put a small piece of cheese or a crumb of bread in her pocket for the mouse. She thought it sensible not to mention the mouse in a village so beset by rodents. She spent a pleasant, cosy night in a corner of the forge on a makeshift bed, but was rudely awakened the next morning. The sun was shining through the gaps in the window shutters, and there were cats meowing and dogs barking and the sound of people whacking at things. She rose quickly to see the villagers chasing black rats all around. She watched the rats carefully. They seemed to enter the village from the forest to the east and fan out, almost as if they were looking for something. She'd almost forgotten about the white mouse. She saw it peek out of her pocket, then squeak in terror and run up her arm and hide in her long hair. "You can't stay there, Mouse. I'm going to pin up my hair in a moment. I'll put on my cape and you can hide in the hood. I have a feeling there is some connection between you and these rats." As she left the forge, a large brindled dog caught one of the rats. As his jaws snapped around it, the rat vanished in a spray of black that the dog spat out of his mouth in disgust. Ruth put on her boots and went in search of another rat. The smith was standing outside the forge with a large hammer. A rat scurried past and he hit it hard. Ruth flinched, waiting for the squelch of flesh and bone, but all there was left was a black smudge on the cobblestones. She knelt down and tested it with a finger. Tentatively, she touched it with the tip of her tongue. It did not taste poisonous, but there was a sootiness to it that was somehow familiar, but that she could not quite identify. Everyone was so intent on chasing the rats that they were not taking any notice of where the rats were coming from. Ruth picked up her bag of useful bits and pieces and set off, tracing the rats, as it were, upstream to see if she could find their origins. The rats were coming in single file between two cottages on the edge of the forest at the east of the village. Beyond, they were streaming down a narrow overgrown path between the trees. Ruth took a deep breath, grasped her stout walking stick, and, with the mouse in the hood of her cape, set off along the winding way. One by one the rats scurried towards the village, largely ignoring her as she sought to avoid treading on them. If one took an interest, she pushed it away with her iron-shod stick. After a while, she left the village behind, and the forest grew thicker and darker. There was still a path, but it was beginning to disappear in the undergrowth, and occasional muddy puddles as it crossed several little streams. But the rats still came on, and she continued on following them back until she eventually emerged into a clearing. There were saplings growing up into the light, but at the heart of the clearing she could make out a ruined stone building. It had been 3 or 4 stories high, but the wooden roof had gone, and the top 2 stories had fallen away, leaving stones scattered around. She could feel the mouse becoming agitated in his perch in her hood. The way into the tower was through a heavy oak door, which was half open. It was from there that the rats were emerging. She realised that it was an old wizard's tower, which somehow brought to her mind what the black stuff tasted of. It was the slightly sooty taste of ink. She peered through the door into the darkness. Even when she pushed the door further open, it was dark within, so she paused and took from her bag a small lantern with a candle end within. She lit the lantern and entered. She could feel the mouse in her hood shifting about, maybe trying to look around. She stood in a windowless entrance hall. The rats were coming down a stairway that snaked around the wall from the first floor. In the enclosed space she could hear the pattering paws. In the middle of the floor before her lay a leather satchel and an untidy heap of clothing. She held out her lantern to see it more clearly. There was a man's cloak and tunic, a pair of breeches and boots. The door above was open a crack, and the rats were squeezing through. She could feel that the mouse was trembling, though with excitement or fear she could not say. She climbed the stairs, trying to avoid the rats. The lock on the oak door above had been broken fairly recently, and she pushed it open. She stepped through. This room was lit by an arched window. There was a rotting tapestry hanging from the wall, and shelves containing dusty jars and some small books. On the floor beneath was an empty open chest with a broken lock. In front of the window there was a battered wooden writing desk. A ray of sunshine fell on a large leather-bound book that lay open there. The rats were growing out of its pages. Instinctively, Ruth reached out with her stick and flipped the book closed without touching it with her hand. The last rat scurried across the floor and disappeared through the door. No more appeared from the book. Gradually, the pattering of rats' paws running down the stairs stopped, and there was silence. Ruth drew closer to the book to look at it more closely. It was, as she had guessed, a wizard's book of spells. On the front cover was written in gold lettering, "The Book of Spells of Wizard Julius of the Tower in the Forest." Where had she heard that name? Then she remembered. She had seen his gravestone. Wizard Julius was buried in the churchyard of St. Leonard's Church in Stoke. She remembers the dates engraved on it. He had died about 30 years ago, at least 15 years before she had started visiting the village. Underneath his name on the book of spells was painted the outline of a rat, which was full of letters. They were unreadable because they were scurrying around, a little like the rats. The mouse must have realised that the rats had gone, because he climbed out of her hood and was sitting on her shoulder, though he was still trembling. Ruth thought for a moment, unsure if her magic would work on a wizard's book. Then she sent down the lantern, made a little gesture with her hands, and sang a little spell. Wizards, let us be kind, be still, and show me your meaning. The spell worked. The letters arranged themselves and then ceased moving. She read, "If any but me let sunshine fall on these words within, may they turn to rats, and as a mouse devour you." Ruth reached up and picked up the white mouse by the scruff of his neck. Holding it before her face, she looked it in the eye. "So this is your fault, isn't it? Those clothes downstairs must be yours. You managed to get away before they ate you, so you must not be entirely stupid." The mouse looked down at his paws, clearly understanding every word. "It's tempting to leave you as you are," she continued, "but I suppose we should try and find a way to restore you to human form. Do we need to find a wizard to do it, or do you know? You can't be a wizard, or you would surely have been more careful. But you must know some wizard stuff. Can you help? I'm a bit out of my depth." The mouse looked up, as if trying to tell her something. He turned and looked at the desk. Ruth put him down. Keeping as far from the book as he could, he ran over to the lantern. She realised that he was staring at the candle flame. Light? No, it can't be light. That would cause the curse to be realised in the first place, so is it fire? Do we need to burn the book? The mouse looked up at her and nodded vigorously. She looked at the big, heavy book, now closed, on the desk, and considered it. "Well then, have a bit of a problem. I only have a candle end. It wouldn't even scorch the cover. I suppose we could burn it page by page, but that would mean opening it again. She paused and thought for a while. Fire. In her mind she saw the smithy in the dim red glow of the forge as she fell asleep last night. The forge! Adam the smith's forge. Adam could get it hot enough to burn. I don't particularly want to touch it. In the end, she fetched the mouse's clothes from the... I can't say that. Mouse's clothes, there we go. From the entrance hall. Using her staff, she managed to wrap the book up and tie it close without touching it. She returned the mouse to her pocket, gathered up the book, put the mouse's clothing in her bag, and with the book under her right arm and the mouse's boots in her left, they retraced the path to Stoke. By the time they arrived at the village green, the last rats had been dispatched. Many of the villagers were there, looking about them and beginning to realise that no more rats were arriving, despite the sunshine. When she saw Ruth, Mother Ann called out to her, "You've stopped the rats! Oh, thank you, Mistress Ruth." "I have one more task to accomplish," Ruth replied. Various people started to ask her where the rats had come from, and what the bundle under her arm might be, but she did not stop to talk. She took the wrapped-up book immediately to the forge. She set down the bundle on the smith's anvil and asked Adam to work his bellows and make his fire hot. "This is something I wish I did not have to do," she said to him, "but I have a book here that I need to burn, partly to make sure that the rats never return, and also to lift a curse. I'll explain it all later, but I started out this morning without any breakfast." Joanna had overheard, and soon brought Ruth a steaming bowl of porridge with honey and cream. The people were clustering around, eager to know what she had done to stop the rats, but they had to wait until she had finished her breakfast. She felt the need to tell the story carefully. She told them about the ruined wizard's tower, and about finding the book and closing it so that the rats stopped. Then she took a deep breath and told them about the white mouse and the curse. The mouse had curled himself up, clearly terrified at how the villagers might treat him. But Ruth opened up the pocket where he had hidden and said to him, "Come on, Mouse, it's time to face the music." The mouse uncurled himself and climbed slowly out of her pocket and onto her lap. It was a tricky moment. Some of the villagers were inclined to leave him as a mouse, or even set a cat on him. But Father Simon reminded them that they were a generally kindly community, and it would be interesting to talk to him and find out the details of what had happened. However, this was only going to happen when the book was burnt. She gave the mouse into the safe hands of Mother Ann. She pulled the clothing from around the book, and Adam the smith took it in his largest pair of tongs. He placed it in the middle of the red-hot fire in his forge and returned to pumping the bellows. The fire grew hotter and hotter, and the leather cover began to smoke, giving off an acrid smell, half burning leather and half magical curse. It took most of the day to reduce the book to ash, so that evening was drawing on when a moment came. The fire seemed to give out something like a sigh, and a puff of greasy purple-black smoke. Mother Ann had put the mouse on a settle in the corner. Suddenly it was not there, and a young man with pale skin and white hair was lying in its place. "Thank you," he said. He was naked, so Ruth handed him his clothes, and he hurriedly dressed. "I've met you before," Ruth cried, "in Woodley End. Your hair has turned white, but I recognise you. You work at the apothecary shop. I bought some tinctures from you." He looked down at his long hair. "My hair!" he cried. "It was black, and now it's white." "Well, you're never going to forget what happened, are you?" said Ruth dryly, but she felt a little bad when he burst into tears. Mother Ann brought him a cup of herbal tea. He gulped it down, and then pulled himself together and, deeply apologetic, told the villagers his story. His name was Conrad. His mother and father ran the inn in Woodley End. What he wanted more than anything was to be a wizard. He could find no wizard willing to take him on as an apprentice without first training at the wizard school in the city of the White Tower, and neither he nor his family had the money. He was taken on by the apothecary, and had saved up and bought some simple books of magic, but it seemed that it would take him years to save up enough for his training. He had heard stories of Wizard Julius, and knew that his tower had been in these parts, and decided to find it in the hope of discovering the wizard's books. He thought he could use them and not have to bother with any proper training. On his day off he would go secretly searching in the forest. Eventually he found the beginning of an overgrown path that led to the ruins of the wizard's tower, followed it, and glimpsed the tower through the trees. Then one Sunday he told his family he was going to visit some friends, and had travelled the path, entered the tower, broken into the room upstairs, and found the wizard's book in a chest in a corner. He'd picked it up and put it on the desk because the light was better. He vaguely remembered the picture of the rat on the cover, but was so excited he had not bothered to take any notice of the moving letters. He had opened the book. But before he had a chance to read any spells, the first rat emerged from the book. Luckily, it frightened him so much that he had run back downstairs before he changed into a mouse. He managed to untangle himself from his clothes, get out of the tower, and cross over one of the tiny streams so that the rats lost his scent. He had hidden in a bush. Unfortunately, the stream was on the path towards Stoke, so the rats just kept going and plagued the village every time the sun shone on the wizard's book. It was hard trying to think when your brain is the size of a pea, but I remembered Mistress Ruth. When I had served her in the apothecary's shop, she told me she was going to Stoke after the weekend, so I found my way to the highway in the hope of meeting her. She was the only person I could think of who might be able to help me. I was terrified that I would be too late. A mouse cannot travel very fast. But I was very lucky, and I was on the road in time for Mistress Ruth to find me. The villagers were angry with him, but Father Simon came to stand beside him. "I have also met Conrad at the apothecary's shop. He has a good heart. He has been very foolish, but we can surely sympathise with his desire to become a wizard. There are not enough wizards in these parts. The older people among you must remember how Stoke prospered when Wizard Julius lived in the tower." Some of the villagers nodded. "The wizards did not put the curse on his book of spells to plague Stoke with ink rats," said Ruth. "He was just trying to protect his magic from anyone not ready for it. And if this young man had taken the book and used the spells, who knows what greater trouble might have happened." "I'm so sorry," Conrad wailed. "I'll do anything to make it up to you. I allow my impatience to put my own life in danger and cause terrible trouble for you." He started to cry again. "You seem to have learned your lesson," said Ruth sternly. "I think if this young man will spend some time clearing up the mess the rats have caused, we might forgive him," said Father Simon. "He can come and fill in the hole in my wall that I made trying to dig the rats out," said Mother Ann. In the end, Conrad spent a week fixing holes and straightening out dented shovels, with the help of Adam and Smith. He had learned his lesson and returned to Woodlead End and worked hard. With a little help from Father Simon, he saved enough to go to the City of the White Tower and train at the Wizard School. Eventually, he returned to Stoke and restored the tower in the forest. He was always as helpful as he could be to the villagers of Stoke, so that they came to regard him as their own wizard. Because of his white hair, he became known as the Silver Wizard, but to his friends, who always included Mistress Ruth Northover, he was always called Wizard Mouse. The end. Ah, that's nice. Join me next time for the first part in The Witch and the Worm.